Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is listening beyond the sound bites. Eric LaMontagne is with me. Eric, how are you?
I'm well.
Good. Eric, as you know, is the Executive Director of Campaign for Vermont. And our special guest this evening is somebody I haven't seen in a while. Deb Markowitz is here with us. I knew Deb when she was Secretary of State and then later on Secretary of Natural Resources.
That's
Deb,
right.
Welcome to the show.
Well, it's so nice to be here.
Yeah, this is great. I don't know how this happened. Did I see you somewhere and I went,
Yes,
oh.
Yes, you said her. I
want
want
her.
to talk to her about climate change.
Yeah, Deb over there, I'm going to let her introduce herself in a minute and all the things she's been up to, but we've asked her to talk about climate change, and then afterwards we have some other exciting things to talk about, so stay tuned. Deb, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? And
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I had was Secretary of State for 12 years,
Right.
and then Secretary of Natural Resources for 6 years.
Right.
And when Peter Shumlin left office, so did I, and I ended up at the University of Vermont as a visiting professor of environmental policy and leadership, which was a wonderful couple years. But more recently, for about the last 5 months, I've been working with an organization called Ceres. And Ceres works with asset owners like pension funds and investors like Trillium Assets or State Street Bank, and to help them influence companies to be more sustainable, both aligning what the companies do with the Paris Climate Accord, also looking at human rights and other social and environmental issues. It's been very exciting. So it's 5 months. Back and forth to Boston.
Yes.
I know.
Oh, really? You still, so
I go
you
back
don't
and-
stay there?
Well, I do. I don't go back and forth every day.
Yeah.
But every week I'll go for part of the week, which has actually been kind of fun.
Yeah,
'cause
I
I've
would say
been in
going to
Vermont a long
Boston.
time.
Let's sign me up for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Can I just ask you, on one of the titles I saw where you're working at UVM, it said the University of Vermont Rubenstein School of Environment, and what is that?
So-
I've never heard
so-
that family name. to
Yeah, so the
UVM.
Rubenstein School is the environmental program for the university.
Oh, very
So it's the
nice.
Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources.
Excellent.
And it's a wonderful program. They really are. They're one of the leading programs up at UVM. And then part of associated with them is the Gund Institute of Environment, which looks at ecological economics. So how do we value natural resources for their ecosystem services, and so I also help them think about how to engage with policy both in Vermont and nationally.
Right. And just before we kick this off, Deb was explained before that she's very much into policy, not into the sciences. So our discussion will be more policy-driven
Yeah,
rather
and
than the details of the science, which I don't understand anyway, so that works out fine for me.
Well, I can talk in a light way, but
Yeah.
there are experts.
Right.
And in fact, there's a national climate assessment that was released just last year about this time, and the scientist who was the primary author for the Northeast section is the state climatologist at UVM. And so if you wanted
no
someone
kidding.
to do a deep dive on the
Whoa.
science, you could make a phone call there.
Well, there, I actually will do that because we're up for it, aren't we?
Bring it
All
on.
we
I
have
actually,
to do is ask the questions. They have to
They have
provide
to
the
answer.
answer.
And you'll have lots of answers about the science. She's
bet.
really great. A geologist. So.
and I actually got my degree through Rubenstein School and
so you
took
know about
classes through Gund as well. So
Huh.
it'll be a bit of a maybe get some of the rust off of my
Yeah,
science
right.
my science background.
deep,
It's been a
dig
few
deep.
years since I've taken any hardcore science classes, but
Yeah.
Yeah, and I met you years before this at the League of Cities and Towns. You
That's
were with
right.
them.
So I started their law center.
Yeah.
It was a long time ago. It was
Yeah.
1989
Yeah.
because I was pregnant with my first child, and they'd been looking for someone to work part-time to help start up a law
Right,
center.
right.
And it was perfect for me, right?
that's great.
Walking distance
Yeah,
from
that's a good
home.
group,
And
so-
it was a great
Yeah,
experience. And it's how I fell in love with the cities and towns of Vermont and the people who run those
Yeah.
communities. And that's what led me to run for Secretary of State.
Yeah, that's it. Great.
Yeah.
Well, glad you did all those things.
It was
That's
lovely.
So cool.
And
And
then-
then, yeah.
sorry, in 30 seconds, what does League of Cities and Towns do for
So-
folks who don't know?
Yeah, so the Vermont League of Cities and Towns is the association of our local governments.
Right, municipalities.
And people, the municipalities, cities and towns decide to join it. They don't have to join it. They pay dues, and in what they get for those dues is a bunch of services. And including they've got a lobbyist up at the State House to make sure that the legislature are thinking about issues from the perspective of cities and towns. And then there's group insurance programs. And that was what was in place when I started. They decided that towns really also needed advice and help. And so when I came on, I developed a whole series of trainings, and I wrote 1 million handbooks, and then would take phone calls from people with
And
questions.
they also run a professional search for interviews and stuff, and identifying candidates. If municipalities don't really have the setup for interviewing all these people
For a town manager.
for a town manager, and so you call up the league, and they will set that in motion for you.
Yeah, it's
is
really a great service,
that's
and it becomes it pays for itself in many cases because they have a self-insurance fund for the liability insurance and the health insurance, and so it often is more affordable for communities to provide those kinds of coverage.
I had Steve Jeffries on the phone, on the program, like the last day he was leaving, because he had been there
for 20
forever,
some years,
ever.
a long
And,
time.
so I had him on, but anyway.
That's
All right, so
good.
let us jump into our topic. So
It's really easy to get off on a tangent
this
with
is
this
a
show.
straight line topic. What is climate change? I mean, that's just the question of the day.
I mean, climate change. So let's step back. People get confused about weather and climate. So weather is when you go outside, is it raining? Is it warm? Is it cold? Climate looks at longer term trends. So when somebody says, oh, look, it's snowing and it's May, it's proof there's no climate change, it's not proof of anything. It's just proof that today there's snow. That's the weather. So scientists have taken a view in the long term of the temperatures across the Earth and how they change over time, and different things influence the temperatures. So historically, if you think about geologic time, there have been like mini ice ages. Well, it didn't just happen randomly, like the sun didn't dim. What happened is there's a volcano that poured out ash, and enough ash to create a cloud so that we didn't get as much sunlight coming in. And so what's happened, and when we're talking about climate change now, what happened is during the Industrial Revolution, starting then, turn of the century, we started burning fossil fuels. First it was coal, and still, to some extent, coal. And what happens is the particulates from coal create sort of like a greenhouse effect, which is why it's called the greenhouse effect, where with greenhouse, when you like put a glass, you've got a sun in a glass, it actually heats up below the glass. And so the particles from these greenhouse gases, or I'm not the scientist. Maybe it's not the particles. What the greenhouse gases do is it creates an environment in which the Earth warms. Not evenly across the Earth. Some places are warming faster than others. The northern hemisphere is warming faster. So Vermont, we're warming faster than the southern hemisphere. And as a result, lots of things happen because lots of things affect the weather. So you've got the climate over time that's changing, but when you think about like the weather report, when you hear the weather report, they talk about where the fronts are coming from, and it's from the winds, and the ocean currents have an impact on that, and the polar ice caps have an impact on it. So what's happened because of the greenhouse gases causing this greenhouse effect and this warming unevenly, but over the Earth, is we're melting the polar ice caps, and that's changing both the currents in the ocean. It's affecting how the ocean's moving around, and the heat of the ocean, how warm the ocean is. So that then creates a cycle with clouds and wind, and as a result of that, we get things like Tropical Storm Irene, where there's a weather front that comes in and sits over us and stays and drops 7 inches of rain in a short period of time. And what's interesting is at the time of Tropical Storm Irene, that was like 2011, you may remember, Scientists at the time would say, this is the kind of thing that we would expect to happen with climate change. We can't say this was climate change, but we know this is going to happen with climate change. And that's because there's lots of factors and it's complicated. These days, they've gotten more sophisticated, so they can say, yeah, this was influenced by climate change. So when we have a tropical storm or a hurricane that's particularly fierce, dropping lots of rain, they know that it's because of the change in the temperature of the ocean, that there's more water, there's more moisture in those clouds, so there's more moisture that gets dropped. They can track it. So even since 2011 and now, the science has really gotten fine-tuned. And we know every year more about climate change. And unfortunately, it's actually not good news. So in 2011, when I first started learning about this, there were all sorts of models and projections, and it's happening faster than they projected, the changes in the
And
planet.
they point at humans for being the major cause.
That's right.
And how do we know that? Only because I look at Vermont, and we could stand on our heads and do everything correct, but I don't think we'd move that needle very far in Vermont because we're so small.
Well,
right?
so we all have to be part of the solution. So
Right.
every single area could say that, if it's just, because
That's
it's really a
probably true.
global
Right,
problem that
leave
needs
me
a
alone.
global solution. So the scientists are sure that it's humans. And in fact, last year, under the Trump administration, they issued the fourth climate assessment that said that as well. So even the Trump administration has said, yes, it's happening, it's human cost. And that's because you can trace it, you can track the changes to the Industrial Revolution. And you know the science about capture of the warmth through this greenhouse effect. And so when you look at history to see where there were other variations, you could find out why. You could say, it was a volcano, it was this, it was that. They could find out what was going on. And in fact, now they have even taken cores in some of the glaciers, so they could really see what was happening, when there were melts and when there weren't melts. And so they really can tell, this is unprecedented in the history of the planet. And that's a problem. That's a problem. But I know I'm talking on that.
No,
I
no,
hope
go
that's
right
okay.
ahead.
No, it's fine.
So last week, I was in New York City for Climate Week, which every year they have a big gathering, an international gathering. It's done at the same time the United Nations is meeting, and you might have seen that Greta Thunberg, the young activist, spoke to the United Nations. But in concert with the United Nations, the folks who are involved in climate change from all over the world gather. And it's really thrilling because there's so much work and so much progress going on. We have to work faster and harder and innovate, but I was so impressed with the amount of effort going on internationally and in the United States to solve this problem for the world.
But there are still a lot of people out there who think this whole thing is made up.
Actually, fewer than you'd think. So the ones who do are loud, but the Yale has regular polling where they're looking at opinions in the United States. And just so you know, in the rest of the world, there is consensus in the rest of the world that climate change is happening, it's human caused, and we need to do things about it. It's in the United States that it became political in a way that was really unfortunate, I think, for the world. So
Because changes would impact on manufacturing.
that's a whole different
Another show.
section here. That's a different show of how it happened, and it had to do with it's a different show. But so around the world, there's absolute consensus because there's consensus among the scientists. It's like saying there's no gravity. Like, yes, this is happening, now let's deal with it. In the United States, though, what they have found is 75% of Americans believe that climate change is happening now and that we need to do something about it, that we need to have some regulation to address it. 75%. So in Vermont, it's 80%. In Texas, it's 60%. In Oklahoma, it's 60%. So even in the reddest states, the majority of people believe that it's happening and needs to be addressed in large part by regulation. So that's really interesting. And that's been a change over time, and that's because we experience it across the country.
Right.
Right, when you have 5 100-year floods in 5 years.
Right.
And these hurricanes that are, each one is beating records, and the fires in California. I mean, we had our first climate change related bankruptcy when Pacific, Gas and Electric in California, because of these wildfires that are climate change wildfires, they've gone bankrupt. And so it is what it is.
What are the most common denier claims that you hear, and what are your rebuttals to those?
So what people so what the talking points are now, because they're actually talking points that we've seen, for people who want to slow down regulation, and they'll say, okay, we know that the climate is changing, like there's no question with the science, and that humans have a large part in it. It's not the only part. It's a large part, though, because you've got El Nino and all these other factors that come into play. But we don't know enough about it. We still don't know how fast or how much humans are causing versus other things. And so the biggest arguments we hear is this uncertainty of just the extent of it. That actually is slowing down because it really it matters, like to communities. So, for example, in Florida, they've seen sea level rise. And if they have and it's expected within the next 50 years to have 3 more feet of sea level rise, and you lose Florida.
Yeah, right.
Right, you lose Florida. So even though some of the politicians in the Senate or whatever don't want to talk about this issue, all of those mayors, all of the county commissioners in Florida, climate change is happening, and they're planning for it, right? They have to deal with it on the ground. And so I think that's the reality, is that there's the political dialogue, but on the ground, people recognize it's irresponsible to pretend the tidal wave is not coming, right? You've got to plan for it and protect your communities.
I have a question here, but I don't think we could do this. It says, how do we stop climate change? But you can minimize it, I'm assuming, because it sounds like there's just so much. I mean, how much can we as people do to change it?
Well, there is a lot we can do. There's this great author, who wrote it's a project actually called Project Drawdown, and it is what this project did is it brought research from all over the world, lots of smart scientists thinking about what we could be doing to reverse climate change, all of the different levers for reversing climate change, and then looked at kind of the scope of the problem and prioritized it. Said, okay, what are the most impactful things that we could be doing? And when I saw this presentation, I was really surprised that one area was food and agriculture, how we grow food, and what we eat. So the big takeaway was, so when they, for example, when most of the rice is grown in paddies that are flooded, and that actually creates a chemical situation where methane gas is released, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Now, you could grow rice a different way. The reason why they grow rice that way is because it allows them not to have to worry about mice and rats, because otherwise these pests will come and eat your rice. And so if you put water, you flood it, it'll grow just fine. It kills everything else. You can have fish in there that you're also harvesting, but the methane release is really significant. So if we change the way we grew rice, it would make a really big difference. So we need smart minds to think about, well, how do you do pest control? Right? That won't require, right? There's a different way of thinking about it. The other big contributor is meat, beef. and to some extent dairy because of cows and methane.
Uh-huh.
But also, a lot of the beef is being produced where there used to be rainforest. So right now the Amazon is burning. And it's burning so that Bolsonaro in Brazil can have more beef and soy produced. And that's a problem, right? So
I missed that. It's burning because they want it to burn?
yes, because they're clearing the land.
Oh, I see.
They're
Oh,
clearing
I
the
see.
land.
Well,
They're
that
clearing the
one
land,
I
so-
know is not good for the environment because
That's
there's, okay.
Because in both,
The
so
Massive
when
trees and the
carbon
breathing,
sink
yeah, right.
getting-
so when you burn the trees, you're releasing the carbon
Right.
that's stored in the trees, and then when you use the land for beef cattle, then the beef cattle
Right.
also are producing methane. So that was interesting. Renewable energy. What's interesting about renewable energy is right now it's cheaper. If you're looking at new energy, like you're investing, you're an investor and you want to invest in a new energy project, renewable energy is now cheaper in most cases, in many cases, than, well, certainly than nuclear, which is
Right.
unfortunately very expensive, but also gas and certainly coal.
Right.
And so as a result, even with our, President Trump saying, the war on coal is over, under his administration, during his time, more coal plants have closed in the United States than under the whole last term of Obama. And right,
And why is that, regulations or?
it's
It's just,
not.
there's not a need?
It just doesn't.
Economics.
It's economics. It's
Yeah,
the
right.
market at work.
Right.
So it's cheaper. So right now in the Great Plains area of the country, so it's
Yeah.
like northern Texas, that whole area, wind is $20 a megawatt hour, and coal is $30 a megawatt hour. So why would you do coal?
Well, right.
Right? Why
sure.
would you? And it also happens to be that many of our largest coal plants are at the end of their lives. You build them for a generation,
Right,
60 years. And then after that, you've got to replace stuff. And who's going to spend millions, tens of millions of dollars
Right.
to upgrade a coal plant when you know the next president is going to go back to the war on
Right.
coal?
Right.
Like, why would you
I'll
do
tell you
that?
how old I am. We had a coal bin in our basement, and they would come with the chute, pour it down, all the coal, and there would be dust for
Fumes.
like forever.
Oh my
You know,
God, your
Dad
poor
would be down-
lungs.
I know. I'm listening to this going, no wonder something's wrong with me.
Well, that's,
There you go.
I mean, that's really neat. I know this, Pat hates it when I go off script, but
I
I'll,
do
I'll
because
warn you.
now
that
Deb
I'll warn you that
I'm
I'm
just
going
going
to do
off
this.
script too.
Yeah, exactly.
But can you talk a little bit about some of these innovations that you've seen in your work? I mean, I've recently read something that, I forget the numbers, but just the amount of the level of effectiveness just from adding a pigment to our pavement so that our roads are a lighter color or our shingles are a lighter color will kind of play that role of reflecting more sunlight instead of absorbing it as much.
Well, let me say that that was part of what is so thrilling about Climate Week.
Right.
Everywhere, people are innovating to try to solve these problems. And those innovations are money makers, right? This isn't, I know earlier on, we were talking and this isn't going to cost, it's not like these solutions are all these fancy, expensive solutions, right? They're opportunities to create new markets for new things, right? Or do things a
Right.
little bit different. And there's a whole range of solutions that are perfect for Vermont because they're land-based. So the United Nations has an arm that is studying climate change and climate solutions, and so it's the IPCCs, the something on the International Protocol on Climate Change.
Oh, there you go.
Came out with their report on land and the role of land with climate change. And what was wonderful is what came out of it was we cannot solve the climate crisis without thinking about how we live on the landscape. And that forests, for example, have to be part of the solution. Agriculture has to be part of the solution, both because it, there are emissions that if we manage the land differently, we could reduce, but also they're carbon sinks. So if you think about carbon, for people who have no idea what I'm talking about, we're made of carbon. Like it's elements. So it's different elements, and when the tree is made of carbon, and so when the tree or the plant decays, the carbon releases into the atmosphere. If you burn it, it releases really fast.
Right.
One of the reasons why we have a problem with climate change, and it's because of the Industrial Revolution, is we pulled up carbon that had been in the earth for millions of years from those dinosaur bones, right? Oil is made from dinosaur bones, having over time, decomposed
Right.
and ultimately turning into oil. So that was a carbon sink that had been hidden in the planet, not
Right.
active,
Locked away.
Yeah,
locked away for millions of years.
Yeah.
So we unlocked that carbon, and it put us out of balance. So how do
Pandora's
we?
box, eh?
Exactly, it was Pandora's box, and
Right.
it has done wonderful things for our lives. Now we can live to 90,
Right.
when before the Industrial Revolution people died at 40. It's really a different. It's been so good to us,
Right.
but also it's Pandora's box.
Right.
So
Interesting.
how do we then think about the carbon sinks in nature? So planting trees, really important.
Right.
So in Vermont it's complex because we know that to keep our forests, we also need to make sure they're productive. So to keep our forests, we actually have to cut trees. But
right.
maybe we shouldn't be burning the trees for like electricity because it's not an efficient use
Yeah.
of burning the trees, because when you burn the tree for electricity to move a turbine, 3/4 of the energy coming out of it is wasted. So, for example, now, they burn wood chips at the McNeil plant. So now they're looking, well, what are we going to do with the waste heat?
Right.
Like we're burning the wood chips, it's, and we're not using it all. So if you use the waste heat, it becomes more efficient. So
There's a movement afoot here in Vermont to encourage people not to live out in the rural areas, but to move more closer to town. And I'm assuming that's part of the climate change thinking because everything's here. Why run it out to the rural areas? And because they've been slowly encouraging people to move downtown.
yeah,
And I
well,
presume that's why.
I think people, actually, two things. I think people more and more want to live in town, and there's just not enough housing. So I think building the housing in towns is in response to a changing demographic.
Oh, really?
Younger people want to live
Oh, where it's more convenient.
where it's more convenient, and actually seniors, older people, want to live where they can walk
Right.
and not have to have mud season and plow and like that. So right now, because of the demographics, there is pressure on our
Interesting.
downtowns, which I think is great.
Yeah.
And it
that's
is, as you described, great for climate change.
Yeah.
So for Vermont, our biggest challenge is transportation, and also the efficiency of our homes, heating our
Right,
homes. It's
right.
winter, like how, and we've got some of the oldest housing stock in the nation. So those are tough nuts to crack. And I don't know, maybe you saw the news, it was just a few weeks ago that Vermont is not on track to meet our goals, our
Right,
climate
I heard-
goals.
yeah.
And that's in part because it's really hard to figure out what is the solution in a rural state to create options, convenient options for people that aren't driving, it isn't you driving a truck
Right.
or your, heavily emitting vehicle, everywhere you go, right? It just, as I described to friends from out of state, we don't really have the mass for mass transit.
Right. No, you don't.
So how do we give convenient options for people? And I had an electric car for a bunch of years and loved it.
Did
it
you really?
It was so much fun because I like the peppy. It's really peppy. It's so much fun to drive. But but we need other models. We need my Leaf was great,
Right.
but I wasn't going to use it like to take all the gardening things and. Once you put a canoe on top of it, it really doesn't go very far, and so we need more choices. We need manufacturers to respond to consumer demand. with more kinds of cars, and so it's a challenge in Vermont to think about how do we address our biggest.
Right.
Our
I think the
biggest
weatherization
emissions.
program has really done, their
They're-
statistics are amazing, what they've done with weatherization.
That, and
I think that's great.
weatherization is also a win-win, because when
Right.
your house is weatherized,
Right.
you're much more comfortable,
Right.
and you're spending less money.
Yeah, you don't
So-
need as much heat.
Yeah,
Excellent.
yeah.
So, go ahead, Eric, if you want to jump in.
And kind of another specific question in Vermont. For Vermont policy, we've seen a lot of these massive solar arrays
Yes.
pop up on the land. So you were talking
Yeah.
about how we use our land, and that's a fairly controversial for a lot of people. You know, I personally, they don't bother me that much. I think it's really creative how some people have realized they can graze sheep underneath them, and they
Yeah.
can still use them for pasture land. But for a lot of people, that's a really controversial policy to be using land that way. Is that so? When you're saying, I'm trying to think exactly how to turn this into a question.
Well, I can answer this, because as Secretary of A&R, this was a question that came to me all the time. I mean,
Oh,
there was
really?
so much controversy over every renewable energy and development. And the way I thought about it was that we were really spoiled in Vermont for a long time, where we were able to export the impacts of our energy choices. So when we were just using energy from the grid, it was coming from coal and gas and other
Right,
places,
right.
and where it was extracted, well, they had to suffer with the externalities, it's called, whatever the impacts, the environmental impacts were. And with distributed generation, solar, and wind, we're taking responsibility, right? There is no energy that can be produced without some impact.
Yep, right.
And for the first time, we were asked to take responsibility for that impact. And I would say in the beginning, some of the projects weren't, we didn't have the regulations in place to require screening and so forth. Like any new innovation, it took a little while for us to catch up. And I also think it takes a while for the eye to catch up. When I was Secretary of State, we had an archivist, Greg Sanford,
Oh, right.
who's really just a
Awesome.
delightful
Yeah.
guy, and he knows everything about all of these historical debates. And he called me up and said, just so you know, we had the same conversations when they first started using silos in Vermont.
Oh,
Everything
Interesting.
people said about industrializing the landscape and it's a blight and it's ruining my view shed, everyone said about silos.
Oh, that's funny. Sorry.
And now it's just
Yeah,
silos.
it's silos, right?
And if you think about it, all those power lines that really ruined the landscape,
Right.
we're just used to them.
Right.
And so it's a transition. Like, I believe it's just a transition, and in 5 more years, 10 more years, it'll just feel part of the working landscape.
I don't know whether it's me, though, but it seems like the wind towers have taken there's not much talk about them, whether the experience they've had with some of the health issues and the birds and the impact on.
Well, so
it's
so
sort
I
of
would say
stopped.
that the reality of the wind turbines is they've been incredibly successful. So for Green Mountain Power and for ratepayers,
Right.
incredibly successful. And in fact, in Vermont, the impact on the birds and bats and things, minimal
Right.
compared to other extractive, right? Other
yeah,
ways to
right,
get
sure.
energy. But it is controversial because they're at the top of
Right.
our mountains.
Right.
And it, again, like when I go and see those wind turbines as I'm driving through Eden, I think it's breathtaking in a beautiful way. But other people don't, and
Right.
especially people, living in the area who are used to hunting on that land.
But
And
has it sort of eased
and-
off a little bit? Because there doesn't
It
seem to
has-
be many discussions about it.
It has eased off for a couple reasons. One is that there are only so many places where wind really makes sense, because you need to have not just, it needs to be in a place that has the constant wind.
Right.
And it needs to be in a place that's convenient to hook into the grid. And it needs to be in a place where the grid needs the energy. And so once you start looking at that, it limits where.
Okay.
And so, you know, there's probably a couple more places where you could have small projects. And someday there may be.
When we went out, we went to Arizona and we went out there. And there's a place like in Mexico, New Mexico. I mean, every place you look, you're surrounded. They're just hills all over the place, and
Full of
they're
turbines.
one after the other. There are thousands of them.
Yeah.
It's amazing out there.
Yeah.
I rode my motorcycle under one in when we went to where were we? Alaska. Yeah, Alaska. We were in Alaska, and
You rode your motorcycle in Alaska.
yeah,
That's
not
exciting.
not Alaska. That was not. I apologize. It was New Brunswick.
Okay.
And they had these turbines right on the water, and we rode underneath them. They are, speaking of
Yeah.
being spectacular.
They're spectacular.
They're huge, and
Yeah.
we felt like little ants
Yeah.
riding underneath them, and they were enormous, just enormous.
And,
That was cool.
and technology's changing too. So they're now coming out with wind turbines that are just like poles that
Right.
turn.
But
And
those
so
are
they'll,
in Denmark like that. Yeah.
and so slowly there'll be new technology
Right.
that produces energy with different kinds, with
Right.
minimal, that minimizes the impacts.
I think the same with the electric cars. You were mentioning what the difference between when they first came out
Oh,
and the
yeah.
way they are now. I wouldn't even mind jumping on the board. It's really
They're so much fun.
They're great.
Yeah, they're really
great.
fun.
In the beginning, not so much, but
Well, in the beginning, they were like golf carts.
It
That was a
was.
long time ago, though.
Right, but now you have, Teslas that can beat a Lamborghini.
no,
Yeah.
for sure. And
Oh, yeah.
Howard Dean had
Actually,
wanted
my
us
Leaf could. I mean, it goes so fast.
when Howard Dean was pushing them. Governor Dean, he wanted them for police,
Right.
but you could never. It's a battery, so when you pressed it, the battery just went You could never speed up quick, 30, 60 miles an hour in a half a second. You're back doing 1 mile an hour, and you couldn't
Well,
catch
so
the bad guys.
but now it goes zero.
Oh, now it's
like-
fabulous.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
now
really
it makes
super.
sense.
There's
So-
a lot going on.
So speaking of wind, I know, one of the reasons wind in Vermont specifically was controversial was due to the anticipated watershed effects of kind of denuding a mountaintop and the effects that would have on downstream, streams,
Yeah.
river, because
Yeah.
you have that sheet runoff of water. And so just using that as an example, and then also
Well,
about
do you want to know what happened?
and
Because we did put up those wind turbines,
and
and it actually
Nothing?
improved water quality in the downstream, and in part because it had been a mountain that was being logged, and some people argue it wasn't being well logged, like the logger wasn't using
Right.
best practices, and in putting up as part of the permitting for the wind project, they were required to do a lot of work to manage the stormwater. And so while the hydrology was altered, it actually ended up being not having an impact. In fact, cleaning up part of the watershed because now there was actual systems in place to manage the stormwater runoff.
They have a structure that
They do. You should-
deals with the water runoff.
Yes, it
I
was
didn't
really.
even know that.
It was, and part of the reason why for Kingdom Wind they cleared such a large area
Right.
initially, which has now grown back. Right,
Right,
it's growing
right.
back. Was to put in the stormwater management system, and they're
Oh.
great and really remarkable engineering. You could get the engineer to come and talk about how
No one
they
ever
did
talked
it.
about that.
Yeah.
That doesn't. ring a
yeah,
bell
and
to
I
me.
guess that was kind of the second part of my. I feel like my question was, I feel like a lot of the barriers towards adopting some of this really necessary technology is people's perceived impacts on their
Yeah.
daily lives or on the world around them, or they see these big projects and big trees going down and they don't really fully comprehend that. So
But also, we didn't know. Like, maybe they would have been right. Like, so the truth is, we haven't done it before,
right.
right? We haven't put in these big wind projects before, and we used all the science and engineering, and guesswork. And we over-engineered it because we really wanted to protect the environment, and it worked. but until it worked, we didn't know it was going to work for sure, right? We were expecting it was going to work.
Right.
So when anything is new, there is a level of adjustment and uncertainty that we have to get used to. And that actually is an interesting circle back to the challenge of climate change. And it's where we started is that it's not linear, right? You've got weather, and then climate are these long-term trends, and it's not just this arc. So one of the challenges for us here in Vermont, as a farming state, is that you like to have a sense of when the last hard frost is going to be, when the first hard frost is going to be, and when you can plant, when you're going to expect the rain, and in fact, our whole ecosystem has evolved around a pattern. And so I remember just a few years ago, we had a very early warm, I don't remember if it was February or March, and so that
yes, the ski areas were hanging on.
But it's the apple trees that really suffered.
Oh, really?
Because what happened is they started to bud, and then there was a hard frost, and it killed them. And then because the apple trees weren't budding, weren't blooming, when the bees came out, the bees need the apple trees to, after winter, it's like, okay, let's get going, let's get the sugar going, right? And so we had a bee die-off. So because
which we can't really afford to have.
Which we can't really afford to have. So, and that's because our whole ecosystem is expecting a certain pattern that's changing, and year to year it's different. So then the next year it's perfectly fine. And the next year after, and it's a variation that is beyond sort of what the norm is. And what's really interesting about Vermont is because we've got a calcium-based soil, we actually, unlike New Hampshire and New York, our neighbors, we are able to accommodate multiple kinds of ecosystems. So different kinds of plants and animals could survive in Vermont. And because we've got this elevation difference, there's somewhere on the landscape that we can have rattlesnakes, for example, in parts of Vermont, right? We've got rattlesnakes in Rutland, and in other, and yet we can also have more Arctic birds at the top of the mountains, right? We have this range so that as we have change, we're a great place for resilience, because as species migrate, because they are going to need to survive, and the migration isn't that they're just walking north, it's that they're not succeeding, and so the trees are dying down here, but they're surviving better up here. Vermont is really will continue to have rich biodiversity because our landscape can support many, many different kinds of plants and animals because of the kind of soil we have.
Interesting. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned it before, fossil fuel. I mean, how do we get off of fossil fuel, and why?
Yeah. It is complicated, but possible. I mean, big company like Amazon just made a pledge to become carbon-free by, I don't remember if it was 2050 or 2035
Because that's
or
part
whatever,
of our plan,
right? Yes.
that we're not meeting yet.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, so the vision in Vermont at the moment is that, because it's now really feasible to get our electric energy from renewable sources, that we begin to do that. And then we begin to think about transportation and how do we electrify transportation. So if we've got our electricity coming from renewables, and then we bring our transportation into electric, then we're off of fossil
And what
fuel.
are those renewables that you think that eventually we're going to be relying on?
Well, we are already relying
on
on solar, hydro, and wind.
And those are the three main things we'll be focusing on.
That's right. And there's other things, geothermal. I mean, there are other ways you can also have renewable energy that help you get to that carbon neutral future. But in Vermont, our electric grid is very green, and it's because of our reliance on hydroelectric, and actually a little little piece of nuclear as well. And so hydroelectric, wind.
Is that off the grid, the nuclear? It's part of the what we buy?
We
we don't
contract
have
with it.
it.
We
Oh,
don't
okay,
have it in
right,
state,
right.
but we contract for a piece of it.
Excellent.
And and so the same thing with heating our homes. So I remember in the 70s, it was very common to have electric baseboard heat.
Right,
Remember
right,
that?
yes.
And
We had it in our house, and it came out within 2 weeks, because back then, you'd have to have a second mortgage and a
right
third mortgage
for
to
the
be able to
electric.
afford
I
it.
know.
Yeah.
I know, and so now they've got lots of new technology for electric heat that really works, and then of course in Vermont many people heat with wood,
Right.
which only is okay if you're using modern wood equipment. So we use a pellet stove that's very efficient. Some of the old wood stoves are actually pretty emitting. So there's a program in the state to help people modernize
Great.
their
Oh, interesting.
equipment at home.
I have to go find out.
Yeah.
We burn wood a lot in the winter,
Yeah.
because it goes straight up the stairs, and we never have to do anything upstairs. Can't even breathe sometimes. It's like so hot. But so that it depends on what the furnace. I mean, what the
It depends
furnace
on
looks
how
like?
efficient you
Oh,
are,
okay.
whether or not you're, you're really, whether wood heat is a good idea for you.
I thought there was a shortage of pellets at one point in time. When people were buying the pellets, there was all of a sudden this shortage, and people were worried about, now what do we do?
Yeah,
But it
so
sounds like it must be okay.
yeah, no, the market caught up.
Yeah,
There's
good.
again with new technology, it takes a while for the market to catch up
Yeah.
and public opinion to catch up.
Right.
As you were talking about with the wind.
Well, I think education on any topic is important, because I'm always, no, it's changed. But after a while, when you've got the right people talking to you about, what it's all about, after a while you figure it out.
Yeah, that's right.
So, what do you think our legislature is up to this year? Because I heard they had a meeting 2 or 3 days ago over in the Essex area, and it was about climate change, and they
Yeah.
were talking about the legislation that they wanted to put forth.
Yeah,
Obviously, the old carbon tax is back.
Well, what's interesting on carbon tax
Yeah.
is last spring in my new job, working at this organization called Ceres, where we're working with investors to help companies become more sustainable. We had 75 corporate CEOs, and we're not talking Ben and Jerry's. We're talking about Pepsi, and we're talking about Unilever. We're talking
nice.
about the Gap. Big multinational
Right.
companies. 75 of them, plus pension fund managers, went to Congress to educate the congressional leaders about the need to put a price on carbon.
Huh.
Shell has been arguing that they need to put a price on carbon. BP. So the major, many of the major companies sees that that by putting a price on carbon, it recognizes that there will be an eventual policy response to climate change that will impact them, and it will allow them to have it'll allow the market to recognize some of that we're in transition. So that being said, there is constantly this conversation, and the governor's been clear, and
Right.
like the governor before him,
Right.
that he resists the idea of going it alone as a state. And so beyond the conversations about price on carbon, there has been a conversation going on about our goals and the fact that we've missed the goals, and it's hard to align policy to meet the goals without having the goals if the goals aren't required in some way. So
I
there
think you need some wins to keep people
exactly.
keep
Yeah.
people going and involved, right?
Well,
Gotta
you've
go
been
down.
in state government, right?
Yep.
So you know that wishy-washy goals versus all of the things you have to do by
Right,
law and
right,
regulation.
right.
Well, what are you going to spend your money on
Exactly.
and your resources? So I think there's going to be a very robust conversation about whether or not we make them required, and we make them, and we make the agency. Maybe it's the Agency of Natural Resources. Maybe it's the Agency of Administration accountable to taking steps to make sure we are on the road to accomplishing the goals.
They've done a lot of work. I'm just thinking of all these things in my house on the efficiencies of dishwashers and
Yes.
refrigerators. I mean, there's a
It's
big
huge.
movement to make those as efficient as possible. Has
Yeah.
that done anything?
It's made a
Has
huge
it-
difference, actually. It made a huge difference.
The Energy Star. You
Yes,
have to buy it
exactly.
with the Energy Star.
And that's the electric piece.
Right.
What's tricky for us is transportation and heating.
Yeah.
And then ultimately it'll also be agriculture. How do we help?
So
manage
just
that?
if we were able to do trains and able to do cars,
Yeah.
is a train pretty?
Well, if you do the train right, the train would be great. I know there's some talk about having a train going from Barrie to, I guess, Waterbury.
Well,
Who knows?
they think they've talked about that once or twice before in the last 20, 30 years. They're always talking about it.
Well, they are
It would be a
connecting
big
Burlington.
Yeah, Burlington with.
To Burlington, to Rutland, to
Right.
New York City.
Now that's fabulous.
I was on. They have a meal train. Where you
Yes.
get on the train and have this gourmet meal as you're riding down to Rutland, and they turn you around and they ride. That was pretty.
Is that
cool.
fun?
Yeah, that was great. That was amazing.
I'd like
It's
to do
just
that.
fun doing like the old days. We used to go down to Florida.
By
and-
train. I remember doing that.
And
The
go to
sleeper train.
Yes, exactly. And go to the dining car. And
Yeah, that's
it was
fun.
cool.
Yeah, in Vermont especially, that policy piece and the conversation around the carbon tax seems to be a really difficult one, because you have the broader goals of, yes, we need to do something, because this is not a sustainable path that we're on. But it seems like no matter what you put out there, somebody's going to be a loser in that equation. And unfortunately, a lot of the policy that we've seen presented so far, the people who are the losers, not really a great term, but
Yeah.
in that equation are the people who can least afford to be put in that position. Do you think, are we going to find that balance, or is it just going to have to be? I mean, eventually the market will catch up, so that initial impact is
Yeah.
not going to be as harsh. But are we going to find a policy that will balance that out and not put some of those folks at a disadvantage, or are people just going to have to deal with it?
Well, so I think there's been a lot of attention being paid. There's a lot of attention being paid to who's benefiting from climate solutions and who's being burdened. And there's a sensitivity to making sure that you really even out the impacts. So that's within Vermont and nationally. There's a really a lot of work going into, how do we make sure that the benefits are spread. So, for example, in Vermont, as we started rolling out the renewable energy, all of the solar, that created a lot of jobs for working Vermonters. It was really great.
They called the green jobs.
It
right?
was the green
Yeah.
jobs, and we were leading. We had 18,000 renewable energy jobs that hadn't existed just a few years before, 5 years before. It was significant. Now, as you build out the renewables, those jobs start to go away, right? So what are they going to be replaced by? And so then it's thinking, as we incentivize a transition, like to cleaner cars and electric vehicles, well, most Vermonters can't afford a brand new car.
Right.
So, they're going to get the used cars later on. So how do you set it up so that ultimately they can choose these cool electric cars too, once they're old enough to be at the price point for them? And meanwhile, how do you help them, do that cash for clunkers? Trade in
exactly.
their really polluting car for more efficient modern cars. So, as we're subsidizing the transition, let's make sure we're thinking about the people who, the working Vermonters, the poor Vermonters.
And also, I don't know that there's that immediate return on investment, because we're really looking to the future for our kids and what's happening to the environment we're leaving them.
Yeah.
Because if in fact all this is true, you've got to start it now, and not wait for the next generation, correct? Because then we'll still be.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's.
But how do you get people to believe this? And I think a lot of people don't.
Well, I actually, you'd ask that same question.
Yeah.
I believe most Vermonters,
They believe it.
because they've experienced
Right,
it.
right.
Like, I grow red peppers.
Right.
When 1979, my first garden, there was no way I was in Chittenden County and growing red peppers wasn't going to be possible. Eggplants, no, that's maybe in Bennington, but not, not like in the banana belt, but we're in a different zone for gardening.
Yeah.
right? Vermonters know that there is change and that it matters. People remember Irene and what it did to the state, and they know winters are not going to be the same and haven't been the same, and so we need to prepare our state for this. So I think that's why, and actually polling shows that Vermonters, more than most of the country, really know that this is happening now and urgent, and we need to act. And I think what happens is people say, "Oh my God, we're such a drop in the bucket. What can I do?"
Well, that's what we hear all the time. I mean, it's going to cost me money, but it's not going to make that major change that we all want to see. Because we do blame China and a few other countries that sort of waft over here. And
well,
what do you do about that?
We're all one world, right? And so two things I believe have to happen at once. We need to have system change, and we need to have individual change. And individual change happens when we have convenient alternatives, right? And one of the things I've observed with the new generation is there is an interest in consuming less, like buying less stuff. And instead buying used, right? Well, buying. Like there's this resurgent in like going to Goodwill and the used clothes store, and it's not everywhere, but like there. And young people want to live in town where they can walk places, and they don't want to own a car. Not everyone, but as when you're looking at the demographics and the opinions from young people, and so that's all great, but we're not going to actually solve the problem unless the incentives change in terms of our economy, and government regulation like creates an even playing field, and that's happening. Coming out of Climate Week, there's a lot going on with respect to systems change that is very promising.
Deb, we have 1 minute and 40 seconds. I just wondered if we haven't covered something that you'd really like to talk about. You could fill us in here, or we could just keep asking questions.
Well, I would just say that when you listen to the news, it's kind of hard because there's a lot of doom and gloom talk, and I'm an optimist. I know that people are resilient, humans are resilient, Vermonters are resilient.
That is true.
We have seen that, and there are a lot of people out there who are really working hard on this, and each one of us can be a part of the solution. It doesn't mean that government's off the hook, or we don't need companies to source things more efficiently and so forth. But we make choices every day, and just starting to be aware of our choices, and will make a difference. Like I always think about the Grand Canyon as a metaphor. Right? I don't know. Have you ever been there?
Oh yes.
It's phenomenal.
It's huge.
It's huge and phenomenal, and it was created by lots and lots of drops of water. Like every drop of water, one drop of water, that's not going to create the Grand Canyon. But all those drops of water over time together makes a huge difference. And, we've seen that in history. If people, we have a culture shift, a change in awareness. And if we act, if we each make these decisions in concert with a lot of the world, we're going to see change.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Deb. It was really appreciate you being here. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the soundbite.